The courtroom smelled of stale coffee and hopelessness. Thomas, a janitor whose hands were rough from years of scrubbing floors, trembled violently as Prosecutor Holloway smoothed his expensive Italian suit. "We are asking for 15 years, Holloway sneered, barely glancing at the defendant, "for grand larceny against Apex Dynamics." Thomas's public defender didn't even look up from his phone. It was a slaughter. But then, a tiny hand slammed onto the heavy mahogany defense table. 11-year-old Zola, wearing a faded Sunday dress and thick glasses, climbed onto her chair. "Objection!" she screamed, her voice cracking but fierce. "Fire this lawyer! I will represent my father!" The gallery erupted in cruel, mocking laughter. Judge Harrison reached for his gavel to throw her out. They laughed because they saw a child playing pretend. But they didn't know that inside her taped-up backpack was a weapon that was about to bring the entire court to its knees. 2. The laughter in the courtroom died down, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. But the weight of the moment didn't come from Zola's outburst. It came from the crushing reality of what had led them here. To understand why an 11-year-old girl was standing on a chair screaming at a judge, you had to understand the quiet, invisible life of Thomas. For 5 years, Thomas had been a ghost within the gleaming glass walls of Apex Dynamics. He was the head custodian, a title that meant he was the man who scrubbed the toilets of geniuses. He buffed the marble floors until they reflected the faces of men like Arthur Preston, the CEO who never once looked down to see who was making his path shine. Thomas took pride in his invisibility. Invisibility meant job security, and job security meant he could keep Zola fed, clothed, and out of the foster system that had swallowed his own childhood. But 2 weeks ago, the invisibility cloak had been ripped away. The Chimera chip, a prototype processor no larger than a fingernail, valued at $5 million, had vanished from the secure R&D lab on the 40th floor. There were no broken windows, no hacked servers, just a missing chip and a single piece of physical evidence, a thumbprint on the chrome handle of the server room door. Thomas's thumbprint. "It's an open and shut case, Your Honor," Prosecutor Holloway had declared in his opening statement, pacing like a shark in a tailored suit. The defendant used his security clearance, a clearance entrusted to him for cleaning, to access the most sensitive room in the building. He saw an opportunity for a quick payout, and he took it. Greed, pure and simple. Thomas sat in the defendant's chair, his head bowed. He wanted to scream. Of course his prints were on the door. He cleaned the door. He polished that handle every night at 10:15 p.m. with a microfiber cloth and lemon-scented disinfectant. He had explained this to the police. He had explained this to the detectives who had torn apart his tiny apartment, overturning Zola's mattress and ripping the stuffing out of her teddy bear looking for the chip. They hadn't found the chip, but they didn't care. "They don't need the chip, Thomas," his court-appointed lawyer, Mr. Gantry, had whispered to him 10 minutes before the trial began. Gantry was a sweaty man who smelled of stale cigarettes and defeat. He hadn't even opened the case file until that morning. "They have the prints," Gantry hissed, checking his watch as if he had a bus to catch. "Look, Holloway is a pit bull. If you go to trial, he'll get you 15 years. Minimum. But I talked to him. If you plead guilty right now, we can get it down to 5. 5 years? Thomas had choked out, his eyes widening in terror. He looked over the rail at Zola, who was sitting in the front row of the gallery, her legs swinging too short to touch the floor, clutching her taped-up backpack. "I can't go to prison for 5 years, Thomas whispered, tears welling in his tired eyes. "I didn't steal anything, and if I go inside, she goes to the system. She has no mother. She has no one. They'll eat her alive." "It's 5 years or 15, pal," Gantry said, shrugging his shoulders. "Don't be a hero. Just say guilty and let's go home. Well, I go home. You go to state." That was the moment the system failed Thomas. It wasn't designed to find the truth. It was designed to process paperwork. He was just a number to be filed away. A janitor who got too close to the sun. But Gantry had made a fatal miscalculation. He hadn't noticed the little girl sitting behind the rail. He thought she was just a scared kid coloring in a book to pass the time. He was wrong. Zola wasn't coloring. For the past 3 years, every night while Thomas worked the graveyard shift at Apex Dynamics, Zola sat in the 24-hour public library across the street. While other kids read comics, Zola read what was available on the free shelves. She read the state penal code. She read Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England. She read the entire archives of the state Supreme Court rulings from 1990 to the present. Thomas thought she just liked the quiet. He didn't know about her mind. Zola had what psychologists called eidetic memory. She didn't just read words, she photographed them with her brain. She could recall the exact page number, the footnote, and the punctuation of every sentence she had ever seen. She remembered the smell of the library dust, the hum of the vending machine, and the specific legal precedent for reasonable doubt in a circumstantial theft case. She had listened to Gantry coerce her father. She had heard the indifference in his voice. She realized with a terrifying clarity that the man paid to protect her father was actually delivering him to the executioner. So when the judge asked if the defense was ready and Gantry started to stand up to enter a guilty plea, Zola didn't think. She acted. She stood on that chair not as a child throwing a tantrum, but as the only competent legal mind in the room. "I said I object!" Zola repeated, her voice ringing out in the stunned silence following the laughter. She hopped down from the chair and marched to the gate that separated the gallery from the court floor. She looked tiny, fragile, and utterly out of place. But then she unzipped her backpack. She didn't pull out a doll. She pulled out a stack of yellow legal pads, filled with handwriting so dense and precise it looked like computer code. "My father is being coerced into a plea deal under false pretenses," Zola stated, her vocabulary suddenly shifting from that of a child to that of a scholar. She pointed a small finger at Mr. Gantry. "Ineffective assistance of counsel, Sixth Amendment, Strickland v. Washington. This man hasn't even subpoenaed the security logs." Mr. Gantry's jaw dropped. Prosecutor Holloway stopped smiling. Zola looked up at the bench, her thick glasses sliding down her nose. "My dad cleans up trash for a living, Your Honor, but that doesn't mean you can treat him like garbage." The air in the room shifted. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Judge Harrison, who had been ready to bang his gavel, froze. He looked at the girl. He looked at the legal pad in her hand. And for the first time in the entire hearing, someone in power actually looked at the defense. "Order!" Judge Harrison's gavel struck the sound block with the force of a gunshot, silencing the murmur of the crowd. The heavy oak echo reverberated through the high ceilings of courtroom 4B. The judge was a man carved from granite, stern, uncompromising, and known throughout the circuit as the Hammer for his intolerance of theatrics. And this was a circus. He glared down from his high bench, his eyes narrowing behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Bailiff," Harrison rumbled, his voice low and dangerous. "Remove this child from the well. And Mr. Gantry, get your client under control before I hold you both in contempt. This is a court of law, not a daycare center." Two bailiffs, massive men with belts weighed down by tasers and handcuffs, stepped forward. They moved toward Zola, who stood her ground by the defense table, clutching her yellow legal pads to her chest like a shield. She looked tiny next to the approaching guards, a sparrow facing down hawks. "No!" The scream didn't come from Zola, it came from the defendant's chair. Thomas, the man who had spent his life making himself invisible, the man who apologized to people when they bumped into him, suddenly surged to his feet. Ideally, a defendant never speaks unless spoken to. But Thomas didn't care about protocol anymore. He saw the bailiff's hand reaching for his daughter's shoulder. He shoved his lawyer aside. Mr. Gantry stumbled back, knocking over a pitcher of water. "Please, Your Honor!" Thomas cried out, his voice raw with a desperation that cut through the sterile air of the room. "Don't touch her! She's not just a child! She knows!" "Sit down, Mr. Thomas," Judge Harrison barked. "One more outburst and—" "She read the books!" Thomas shouted over him, tears finally spilling onto his cheeks. He pointed a trembling finger at Zola. "I work nights. I can't afford a babysitter. She sits in the library until midnight. She reads everything. Statutes, case files, things I don't understand. She knows more than him." He gestured violently at Gantry, who was busy wiping water off his cheap pants. "She is the only person in this world who believes me," Thomas sobbed, his energy draining as quickly as it had come. He slumped against the railing, looking small and broken. If you take her away, you might as well lock me up forever. Please, just listen to her. The room fell into a stunned silence. It was the kind of silence where you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Judge Harrison held his gavel in midair. He looked at the weeping janitor. Then he shifted his gaze to the little girl. Zola hadn't moved. She hadn't flinched when the bailiffs approached. She was looking directly at the judge, her chin lifted, her eyes magnified by her thick glasses. There was no fear in her face. There was only a terrifying, focused intelligence. Harrison lowered the gavel slowly. He was a man of the law, but he was also a grandfather. And he had seen many lawyers stand in that spot, arrogant, bored, unprepared. He looked at Gantry, who was clearly incompetent. Then he looked at Zola. He made a decision that would put his own career on the line. "Bailiff," Harrison said softly, "stand down." The guards hesitated, then stepped back. Prosecutor Holloway leaped up, his face flushing red. "Your Honor! This is absurd! You cannot possibly entertain the idea of a minor—" "Sit down, Mr. Holloway," Harrison commanded. He didn't look away from Zola. The judge leaned forward, clasping his hands together. He stared down at Zola, his expression turning cold and hard. "Young lady," Harrison said, "do you know what a courtroom is?" "It is a forum for the impartial administration of justice," Zola replied instantly, her voice clear and steady. "Established to resolve disputes under the authority of the state." Harrison raised an eyebrow. A textbook definition, but memorizing a definition was easy. Understanding the law was different. "You claim your father is being misrepresented," Harrison said. "You claim you can do better. That is a bold claim for someone who still has a bedtime." "Competence is not determined by age, Your Honor," Zola shot back. "It is determined by the mastery of the facts and the application of the law. Ferretta v. California, 1975. A defendant has the constitutional right to refuse counsel and represent himself. My father grants me his proxy." Holloway scoffed audibly. "This is a farce." Harrison silenced him with a hand. He looked at Zola for a long moment, weighing the insanity of the situation against the undeniable fire in the girl's eyes. "Very well," Harrison said. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "I am going to make you a wager, Miss Zola." He pointed a finger at the large clock on the back wall. "I will give you 5 minutes. You may speak for the defense. You may present your argument." Zola nodded, clutching her notepad tighter. "But," Harrison continued, his voice darkening, "the law is not a game. It is a weapon, and if you wield it incorrectly, you get hurt." He leaned over the bench, his shadow falling over her. "If you misuse a single legal term, if you misquote a single statute, if you waste my time with emotional appeals or childish stories, I will hold your father in contempt. I will revoke his bail. He will go to prison immediately." Thomas gasped. "And you," Harrison added, his eyes boring into hers, "will be removed by Child Protective Services for negligence and placed in state care before lunch. Do you understand the stakes?" It was a brutal, impossible test. He was asking her to walk a tightrope over a pit of vipers. One slip, one stutter, one wrong word, and her family would be destroyed forever. The entire courtroom held its breath. Prosecutor Holloway smirked, crossing his arms. He knew no child could handle that pressure. He waited for the tears. He waited for her to run to her daddy. Zola didn't blink. She looked at her father. She looked at the terrifying judge. "I accept," she said. She turned to the bailiff. "I need a box, please. I can't reach the microphone." Someone in the back row stifled a giggle, but it died quickly. The bailiff, looking bewildered, slid a heavy wooden step stool behind the defense podium. Zola climbed up. For the first time, she was tall enough to see over the wood. She placed her yellow pads on the surface. She adjusted her glasses. She looked at Prosecutor Holloway, who was checking his manicure. She took a deep breath, and when she opened her mouth, the little girl disappeared. "Your Honor," Zola began, her voice projecting with a resonance that startled the stenographer. "The prosecution rests its entire case on the doctrine of res ipsa loquitur. The thing speaks for itself. They claim the presence of a fingerprint implies guilt, but under the Criminal Procedure Law, Section 405 regarding circumstantial evidence, the prosecution has failed to meet the burden of proof. They have established presence, not intent, and certainly not action. She flipped a page of her notepad, the sound echoing like a crack of a whip. Furthermore, she continued, picking up speed, the prosecution has suppressed exculpatory evidence in violation of the Brady Rule, and I intend to prove it in the next 4 minutes. Judge Harrison's eyes widened. He glanced at the clock. The timer had started, and the war had begun. Part 4. The Glitch in the Matrix. Your Honor, I request permission to treat the prosecution's primary evidence, Exhibit A, the surveillance footage, as hostile. The request hung in the air, audacious and absurd coming from a girl standing on a wooden box. Prosecutor Holloway let out a short, incredulous laugh. He buttoned his suit jacket, confident that the clock was ticking down on this charade. Hostile? Holloway scoffed, turning to the jury with a theatrical spread of his hands. It is a video file, Your Honor. It has no feelings. It shows the defendant entering the lab. It shows him leaving. It is a digital recording of reality. Unless Miss Zola is suggesting the camera itself has a vendetta against her father? I am suggesting, Zola said, her voice cutting through his sarcasm like a razor wire, that reality has been edited. Judge Harrison stared at the girl. He glanced at the clock. 3 minutes left. Permission granted, Harrison grunted. Bailiff, dim the lights, play Exhibit A. The massive projector screen lowered from the ceiling. The courtroom darkened. The grainy black and white footage of the 40th floor corridor at Apex Dynamics began to play. The silence in the room was heavy. On screen, the timestamp read 22 minutes, 00 minutes, 15 seconds. A figure in a gray jumpsuit, Thomas, pushed a cleaning cart into the frame. He looked tired. He swiped his badge, unlocked the door, and entered the server room. The time ticked by. 22:15. Thomas exited, locking the door behind him. There, Holloway said, his voice dripping with condescension. He goes in, he comes out. No one else enters. The chip is gone. The math is simple, kid. Even you can do it. Pause, Zola commanded. The bailiff hit the button. The image froze on the screen. Thomas was just exiting the room. The timestamp read 22:15:03. Zola picked up a laser pointer. The red dot danced on the screen far above her head. She didn't point at her father. She pointed at the floor, specifically at the thin, dark gap between the bottom of the lab door and the linoleum tiles. Mr. Holloway, Zola said, her voice dropping to a professorial tone that sounded eerie coming from a child. Are you familiar with the concept of frame interfield interpolation? Holloway blinked. Excuse me? It's a technique used in video editing to smooth over cuts, Zola explained, not waiting for him. To the naked eye, this video looks continuous. The timestamp counts up perfectly, 01, 02, 03. But the camera doesn't just record people, it records light. She moved the laser dot to the shadow spilling out from under the door crack. The hallway lights at Apex Dynamics are industrial fluorescent tubes, Zola recited from memory, visualizing the building schematics she had memorized from her father's safety manuals. They buzz. They flicker at a rate of 60 hertz, 60 cycles per second. It's invisible to the human eye, but not to a high-speed security camera. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, please watch the shadow under the door crack. Watch the flicker pattern. Zola nodded to the bailiff. Frame by frame, forward, slowly. Click, click, click. The video advanced. The shadow under the door pulsed rhythmically with the unseen lights. Pulse, pulse, pulse. Stop! Zola shouted. The screen froze at 22:12:10. Now go 1 frame forward. Click. The room gasped. It was subtle. So subtle that a tired lawyer or an arrogant prosecutor would never have seen it. But magnified on the big screen, it was undeniable. In the span of 1 frame, a fraction of a second, the shadow under the door didn't just pulse, it shifted. The angle of the light spilling from the hallway jumped 3 inches to the left. "Did you see that?" Zola whispered into the microphone. "The shadow jumped." Holloway frowned, stepping closer to the screen. "So?" A light bulb flickered. "This proves nothing." "Light doesn't teleport, Mr. Holloway," Zola retorted. "Physics dictates that shadows move only when the light source moves or the object moves. The hallway lights are fixed. The door is fixed." She turned to the jury, her eyes blazing behind her thick lenses. "The only explanation for that shadow jumping 3 inches is that time has passed. The sun, or the moon, or the ambient light outside the windows shifted. But the timestamp on the video says only 1/30th of a second passed." She slammed her hand on the podium. "The timestamp is a lie. Someone cut the tape. They spliced out a section of time, maybe 3 seconds, maybe 3 minutes, and then digitally pasted a fake timestamp over it to make it look seamless. But they forgot to fix the shadows." Zola turned back to Holloway, who was now loosening his tie, a bead of sweat forming on his forehead. "Someone else entered that room, Mr. Prosecutor," Zola declared, her voice ringing with the force of a closing trap. "And whoever edited this video to hide them, they didn't account for a janitor's daughter doing her homework." "Objection!" Holloway shouted, but his voice lacked its usual thunder. This is speculation, technical conjecture." "It is spoliation of evidence," Zola screamed back, throwing a legal term right in his face. "Tampering with a crime scene. And under the federal rules of evidence, if the prosecution relies on altered evidence, the case must be dismissed." Judge Harrison leaned forward, peering over his spectacles at the frozen screen. He saw the shadow. He saw the impossible jump. He looked at Holloway, his expression darkening from annoyance to fury. "Mr. Holloway," the judge rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "Do you have an explanation for why your watertight evidence appears to defy the laws of physics?" Holloway stammered. He looked at his assistants. He looked at the Apex Dynamics executives sitting in the back row. They were all looking down at their shoes. I was not made aware of any editing, Your Honor," Holloway said weakly. "Then you are either incompetent or complicit," Zola said. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply turned the page of her yellow pad. "But I don't just want the case dismissed," Zola said, looking up at the stunned judge. "Because that doesn't prove my father is innocent. It just proves the police are lazy. I want to prove who really went into that room." She pointed to the back of the courtroom. "I call my first witness, Mr. Arthur Preston, CEO of Apex Dynamics." The double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Arthur Preston didn't just walk in, he arrived. Dressed in a bespoke Navy suit that cost more than Thomas's lifetime earnings, Preston moved with the easy, predatory grace of a man who owned the building, the block, and likely several of the politicians in the city. He was the golden boy of Silicon Valley, the visionary behind Apex Dynamics, and the architect of the Chimera chip. He strode to the witness stand, flashing a charming, practiced smile at the jury. He took the oath as if he were ordering a latte. When he sat down, he didn't even look at Zola. He looked at Judge Harrison with a look that said, "Let's get this over with, I have a tea time." "Mr. Preston," Zola said. Her voice was small, barely reaching over the edge of the witness box. Preston leaned forward, squinting down at her with exaggerated amusement. "Hello there, sweetheart. Shouldn't you be in school?" The jury chuckled nervously. Holloway smirked. It was a power move, dismissing her before she even started. Zola didn't flinch. She adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Preston, please state your role at Apex Dynamics for the record." "I am the founder and CEO," Preston said, checking his Rolex. "And as CEO, you are responsible for the security protocols of your building, correct?" "Ultimately, yes, though I have people for that." "Of course," Zola said, flipping through her legal pad. "You have people to clean your floors, people to secure your doors, people to edit your videos." "Objection!" Holloway jumped up. "Argumentative!" "Sustained," Harrison said, though he was leaning forward, intrigued. "Stick to the facts, Miss Zola." "The facts, yes," Zola nodded. She looked up at Preston. "Mr. Preston, you claimed in your police statement that the R&D lab the room where the chip was stolen, is the most secure room in the city. Is that correct? Absolutely, Preston boasted. It utilizes a military-grade biometric lock, specifically the Aegis 9 system. It requires a retinal scan and a thumbprint. It is impenetrable. That's why we know your father did it. His print was on the handle. He must have tricked the sensor. Tricked a military-grade sensor? Zola asked innocently. With a mop bucket? Preston shrugged. Criminals are creative. Interesting, Zola said. She reached into her backpack. This time she didn't pull out a legal pad. She pulled out a dirty, crinkled spiral notebook. The cover was stained with coffee and bleach. Do you know what this is, Mr. Preston? Preston sneered. Trash? This is my father's shift log, Zola said. He writes down every room he cleans, every time he refills a soap dispenser, and every time a door is unlocked for him. Because unlike you, he is accountable for his actions. She opened the notebook to a page dated 2 weeks ago. On the night of the robbery, my father noted that the door to the R&D lab was already unlocked when he arrived at 10 p.m. Preston laughed, a loud, barking laugh. That's a lie! That door never unlocks without a scan. The system logs everything, and the system shows no entry until your father's print at 10:15. The system logs everything when it is online, Zola corrected. She walked over to the evidence table and picked up a piece of paper. It wasn't a stolen document. It was a printout. Mr. Preston, are you familiar with the concept of a system purge? Preston's smile faltered, just a fraction. I'm a tech CEO. Of course I know what a purge is. Good, Zola said. Then can you explain this email? She held up the paper. I found this in the dumpster behind Apex Dynamics 3 days ago. My dad brings me to work sometimes because we can't afford heat at home. While he cleaned your office, I practiced reading. I read everything, even the shredded paper in your personal bin. The courtroom went silent. Preston shifted in his seat. This is a printout of an email sent from your personal account to the head of IT at the 9:45 p.m. on the night of the robbery, Zola read. Subject, maintenance window. Content, disable Aegis 9 logs for level 40, reboot system for firmware update, keep offline for 30 minutes. Zola lowered the paper. You ordered the security system to be turned off 15 minutes before my father arrived. That is standard procedure, Preston stammered, his face losing its golden tan. Updates, patches, we do it all the time. At 9:45 p.m. on a Tuesday, Zola pressed. During a critical development phase? And why did you order the logs to be disabled? Updates don't require deleting history. It's technical, Preston snapped, his voice rising. You wouldn't understand, you're a child. I understand that if the system was offline, Zola said, her voice rising to meet his. Then the biometric lock was disengaged. The door was open. Anyone could walk in. My father didn't trick the sensor. There was no sensor. She turned to the jury. My father put his thumb on the handle because he had to open the door to clean the floor. He left his print on a handle that you unlocked for him. You have no proof I unlocked it, Preston shouted, standing up. That email proves nothing. It proves I ordered maintenance. It doesn't prove I stole my own chip. You're right, Zola said calmly. The email doesn't prove you stole it. She walked back to her podium. She looked at Judge Harrison. She looked at the terrified Holloway. And then she looked back at Preston with a smile that was terrifyingly adult. The email doesn't prove theft, but the insurance policy does. Preston froze. He sat back down slowly, his hands gripping the railing until his knuckles turned white. He realized too late that he hadn't walked into a courtroom. He had walked into a trap set by a girl who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. 6. Part 6. The Truth About the Chip. Arthur Preston laughed again, but this time the sound was brittle, like cracking glass. He tugged at his collar, his composure unraveling stitch by expensive stitch. Insurance fraud? Preston scoffed, looking at the jury with wide, incredulous eyes. This is slander, plain and simple. I run a billion-dollar company. The Chimera chip is the most advanced piece of silicon ever created. It is the future of AI. Why would I steal my own masterpiece? Because it didn't work, Zola said. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the court stenographer stopped typing. Preston blinked. Excuse me? The Chimera chip, Zola repeated, her voice steady and clear. It was a failure. It was vaporware. You don't know what you're talking about, Preston spat, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. That chip was capable of 50 trillion operations per second. According to your marketing brochure, yes, Zola said. She walked back to her table and picked up a thick, bound document. It wasn't a secret file. It was a glossy booklet with the Apex Dynamics logo. But according to the laws of thermodynamics, no. She held up the booklet. I read your white paper, Mr. Preston. It's available on your website for investors. Page 32 describes the chip's architecture. You claim to fit 50 billion transistors on a 7-nanometer die using a new, stacked architecture. She turned to the jury, channeling the energy of a seasoned professor lecturing a room of freshmen. The problem is heat dissipation. If you run that much current through that small a space without liquid nitrogen cooling, the chip doesn't process data. It melts. It catches fire. She turned back to Preston. I checked the utility logs for the R&D lab, also public record for commercial buildings. For the last 3 months, your power consumption spiked, but your cooling output remained flat. That means you weren't running tests. You were running simulations. The chip never physically worked, did it? It was a prototype, Preston shouted, standing up and slamming his hands on the witness stand. Prototypes have bugs. That's why we were testing it. Bugs are software errors, Zola corrected calmly. Physics is a wall. You hit the wall, and you had a deadline. She dropped the white paper and picked up a financial report. Apex Dynamics is a publicly traded company. I read your Q3 earnings call transcript. You promised investors a working demo by the 15th of this month. If you failed to deliver, your stock would crash. You were bleeding cash. You were 3 days away from insolvency. Preston opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. He looked like a man who had been punched in the gut. So, Zola continued, connecting the dots for the mesmerized courtroom. You had a chip that didn't work. You had investors demanding a miracle, and you had a bankruptcy looming. You couldn't show them the chip because it would melt. You couldn't admit failure because you'd lose everything. She took a step closer to the witness stand. So, you decided the chip had to disappear. Preston's eyes darted around the room, to his lawyer, to Holloway, to the exit. This is conjecture. You have no proof of motive. Exhibit C, Zola announced. She pulled a single sheet of paper from her taped-up backpack. It was a photocopy of a dense legal contract. This is page 142 of your corporate insurance policy with Lloyd's of London. Clause 44B, theft of intellectual property and prototypes. She adjusted her glasses, reading the fine print that no lawyer in the room had bothered to check. In the event of a verified theft of a Class A prototype, the insurer agrees to pay out the projected market value of the asset, not the manufacturing cost. The projected value of the Chimera chip was set at $50 million. The gasp from the gallery was audible. $50 million. If you launch the chip, everyone sees it's a dud and your stock goes to zero, Zola reasoned, her voice rising with the momentum of truth. But if the chip is stolen, oh, what a tragedy. The world loses a masterpiece. You get the sympathy of the market. You get an extension from your investors. And most importantly, you get a check for $50 million. She looked at her father, Thomas, who was watching her with tears streaming down his face. He finally understood. He hadn't just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had been chosen. But for the insurance to pay out, Zola said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream, it had to be a crime. It couldn't just be lost. Someone had to steal it. You needed a villain. She pointed a small, accusatory finger at Preston. You needed someone with access, someone invisible, someone poor enough that everyone would believe he did it for the money, someone who couldn't afford a good lawyer to fight back. Preston sank back into his chair. He looked small, The arrogance was gone, replaced by the hollow look of a gambler who had bet the house and lost to a child. "You didn't lose a chip, Mr. Preston," Zola concluded, closing her notebook with a definitive snap. "You sold my father's freedom for $50 million. Preston stammered. "I invoke the Fifth." "The Fifth Amendment protects against self-incrimination," Zola said sharply, "but it doesn't protect you from the truth." She turned to Judge Harrison. "The defense rests, Your Honor, and I move for an immediate dismissal with prejudice." The silence in courtroom 4B was no longer heavy. It was electric. The jury looked from the sweating CEO to the small girl in the oversized glasses, their expressions shifting from skepticism to awe. But Prosecutor Holloway wasn't done. He couldn't be done. His career, a flawless record of convictions that he planned to ride all the way to the district attorney's office, was crumbling before his eyes, and it was being dismantled by a janitor's daughter. He stood up. He didn't look confident anymore. He looked desperate. A cornered animal is most dangerous right before it dies. "Your Honor," Holloway said, his voice tight, "this is an impressive story, truly. A fairy tale woven from conspiracy theories and dumpster diving." He walked toward the jury box, trying to reclaim the narrative, trying to use his height and his baritone voice to intimidate the room back into submission. "But let's look at the reality. We have a fingerprint. We have a poor man with a mountain of debt. And now, we have a daughter who is clearly coached, reciting legal terms she memorized to save her daddy." Holloway turned to Thomas. He pointed a finger that shook slightly. "Look at him. He's a janitor. He makes minimum wage. He has 3 credit cards in default. He is desperate, and desperate men do desperate things." He spun around to face Zola, looming over her podium. "You speak of motives, little girl? What about your father's motive? $5 million on the black market would solve all your problems, wouldn't it? It would buy you a house. It would buy you nice clothes instead of whatever this is." He gestured dismissively at her faded dress and taped shoes. It was a low blow, a cruel, classist strike meant to humiliate her, to remind everyone that she was dirt and he was gold. "Poverty is a powerful motivator for crime," Holloway sneered. "It breeds dishonesty." Thomas flinched. He looked down at his worn hands, shame burning his neck. But Zola didn't look down. She looked up, way up. She didn't retreat. She stepped out from behind the podium. She walked right up to Holloway until she was standing toe-to-toe with his expensive leather shoes. "You're right," Zola said clearly. "We are poor." She turned to the jury. She didn't hide her clothes. She didn't hide the tape on her shoes. She owned them. "My father makes $12 an hour. We live in a 1-bedroom apartment where the heater doesn't work. Sometimes we eat toast for dinner because that's all there is." She looked back at Holloway. "But do you know what my father does every night before he goes to clean your floors?" Holloway blinked, caught off guard by her candor. "I don't care." "He checks my homework," Zola interrupted. "He sits with me at the kitchen table, in his uniform, tired to his bones, and he reads with me. He doesn't read me fairy tales about princes saving princesses. He reads me the Constitution. He reads me the Bill of Rights." She walked over to Thomas and took his rough hand in hers. "He taught me that the law is the one place where a janitor is supposed to be equal to a CEO. He taught me that integrity isn't about what you have in your bank account, it's about what you have in your heart." Zola turned to the jury, her voice ringing with an emotional power that no law school could teach. "Mr. Holloway says poverty breeds dishonesty. I say he is projecting." She pointed at Arthur Preston, still cowering in the witness stand. "That man has billions. He has private jets. He has everything. And yet he stole. He lied. He framed an innocent man to save his own ego." She pointed back at her father. "My father has nothing. But when he found a wallet in the lobby 3 years ago with $2,000 in it, more money than he makes in a month, he turned it in. Every cent. Because he is a good man." Tears streamed down the faces of the jurors in the front row. "You look at my father and see a criminal because he is poor," Zola said, her voice trembling with righteous anger. "I look at him and I see a hero. Because he didn't steal that chip. He didn't steal anything. The only thing stolen here today is the truth. And you, Mr. Prosecutor. She looked Holloway dead in the eye. You helped bury it. You didn't care about justice. You just wanted to win. You saw a janitor and thought, he's easy. No one will miss him. Well, guess what? Zola straightened her spine, looking 10 feet tall. I missed him, and I am not going to let you take him. Holloway stood frozen. The courtroom was silent, but this time, it wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of respect. Judge Harrison looked down at the prosecutor. His expression was one of profound disappointment. Mr. Holloway, Harrison said quietly, do you have any actual evidence to rebut the defense's claims? Or are you just going to continue insulting a child who has out-litigated you at every turn? Holloway opened his mouth. He looked at the jury. He saw their faces. They weren't looking at him like a protector of the law anymore. They were looking at him like a bully who had just been punched in the nose. He closed his mouth. He sat down heavily at his table. He didn't just lose the case, he lost the room. I have no further questions, Holloway whispered. The clock on the wall ticked past noon. The sun streamed through the high windows of courtroom 4B, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Or perhaps it was the debris of 2 destroyed careers settling after the explosion. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Harrison asked. His voice was no longer the terrifying rumble of a storm. It was calm, almost gentle. The jury foreman, a middle-aged schoolteacher who had been weeping openly during Zola's closing speech, stood up. She didn't need to look at the paper in her hand. She looked straight at Thomas. We have, Your Honor. Thomas squeezed his eyes shut. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. Beside him, Zola stood tall on her wooden box, her hand resting on his arm. She wasn't trembling. She had done the work. Now, she trusted the law. In the matter of the People versus Thomas Vance, the foreman announced, her voice ringing clear, on the charge of grand larceny, we find the defendant not guilty. A collective exhale swept through the room like a gust of wind. On the charge of corporate espionage, not guilty. On all counts, not guilty. Thomas let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. His legs gave out and he slumped into his chair, covering his face with his hands. He was free. The nightmare was over. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. He banged his gavel once, sharp and final. The defendant is discharged, Harrison declared, but this court is not adjourned. The judge turned his gaze, a gaze that could curdle milk, toward the prosecution table. He looked at Arthur Preston, who was trying to sneak out the side door. Bailiff, Harrison barked. Stop that man! 2 guards blocked Preston's path. The billionaire froze, looking back with wide, panicked eyes. Mr. Preston, Harrison said, his voice dripping with icy contempt. Based on the evidence presented today, specifically the sworn testimony regarding the system purge and the insurance fraud implications, I am holding you in contempt of court. Furthermore, I am forwarding the transcript of these proceedings to the district attorney's office with a recommendation for immediate indictment on charges of perjury, insurance fraud, and filing a false police report. Preston's face went pale. You can't do this. I'm Arthur Preston. I have lawyers. You'll need them, Harrison said dryly. Take him into custody. As the bailiffs clicked the handcuffs onto the wrists of the man who had thought himself untouchable, a ripple of applause started in the gallery. It grew louder, swelling into a roar. Then, Judge Harrison turned his eyes to Prosecutor Holloway. Holloway was staring at his desk, unable to meet the judge's eyes. Mr. Holloway, Harrison said, in my 30 years on the bench, I have never seen a more shameful display of prosecutorial misconduct. You ignored exculpatory evidence, you bullied an indigent defendant, and you allowed a fraud to be perpetrated in my courtroom because you were too lazy to check a timestamp. Harrison leaned forward. I am filing a formal complaint with the State Bar Association. Expect a review of your license by Monday morning. Holloway slumped. His career was effectively over. Finally, the judge looked at the defense table. His expression softened completely. A rare, genuine smile broke through his stone face. Miss Zola, Harrison said. Zola looked up, clutching her father's hand. Yes, Your Honor. You violated about a dozen procedural rules today, Harrison said, a twinkle in his eye. You practiced law without a license. You turned my courtroom into a lecture hall. And you embarrassed two grown men in expensive suits. He paused. It was the finest display of legal advocacy I have ever witnessed. The judge stood up. It was a breach of protocol, but no one cared. When you pass the bar exam in, I assume about 7 years, come find me. I'll hire you on the spot. Thank you, Your Honor, Zola beamed, her smile finally returning to that of an 11-year-old girl. But I think I'm going to be a judge. Harrison laughed. God help the criminals, then. He banged the gavel one last time. Case closed. Thomas lifted Zola off her box and hugged her tight. He buried his face in her small shoulder, weeping freely. You saved me, Zoe. You saved me. I told you, Daddy, Zola whispered, hugging him back. I'll defend you. Always. The courtroom erupted in applause again as the father and daughter walked down the aisle, not as a janitor and a poor kid, but as a free man and his guardian angel.